And welcome to the Gold, Goats, and Guns podcast for February 3rd, 2024. My name is Tom Luongo, and we have a lot to talk about. This is episode 169. Wow, I got 3 out this week. And I have the great pleasure, actually, of bringing back a regular guest on the show. It's been a while since he and I talked. Alastair Crooke is with us today of Conflicts Forum, and you know his work from, you see him on with the Judge, Napolitano all the time, and Strategic Culture Foundation. So we're going to talk. Hopefully, Alastair is going to help me bridge some of my gaps in my knowledge about what's going on between Israel and Gaza and how that ties into the greater conflict. So, Alastair, good morning, and thank you for doing this.
It's always a pleasure to be here with you, Tom.
Thank you.
As you say, we've known each other quite a while now.
Yeah, we have, and actually, it was funny. I'll be honest with you. You know, you reaching out to me originally was one of the early signs that I knew I was on the right track with what I was doing, and I really do appreciate that. It was a big vote of confidence back in 2017, 2018, whenever our relationship started up. It's old enough now that I don't quite remember the quote unquote incept date, right? So in preparation for this talk this morning, you sent me your last 2 articles from Strategic Culture, which I found fascinating, and they were, if I can summarize, they were trying to inform everyone what the real parameters are of the conflict between Israel and the Palestinians over Gaza, and then and now Lebanon. And I'd like you to in effect really just kind of start to summarize those arguments and let everybody understand, because if I understand this correctly, and I think I do in a general sense, that we're talking about all the wrong things when it comes to this conflict. And so for that reason, it's time to, start talking about the real conflict. And now that it's a few months old, and we're on the edge of what looks like a major escalation, especially with the bombing campaign we saw from Biden last night. I'd like you to start there if you could.
Okay. Well, for those of your listeners who are very familiar with this, please excuse it, but there's some very important background that you need to know, which is very seldom mentioned in the press, in the mainstream media at all. Just over a year ago, there were elections in Israel, and it was quite an extraordinary result. And I just want to make clear the revolution that took place just over a year ago, when for the first time, and my wife Aisling, who spent many years in Palestine, and she said, "Look what's going on there. It's the Mizrahi marching into the Prime Minister's office." The Mizrahi are the Jews that come not from Europe, but from North Africa and the Middle East. And they were always the underclass in Israel. These were the people that did mostly, the dirty jobs, if you like, of Israel. They weren't the Ashkenazi who lived in Tel Aviv and in Herzliya. And they were in power, and they've been trying to get in power for a long time. And they kept missing because various reasons, but the way the Arab list was gerrymandered to keep them out of power. But they were in power a year ago, and they came into power with a hugely radical program. And it had 3 main elements that I want to say. The first one was they were going to establish Israel on the land of Israel, the formal biblical land of Israel. No one knows quite how far that goes, but Greater Israel probably goes up to the Litani in Lebanon and down to the Sinai, and from the river to the sea. And they said they were going to establish that in the land of Israel. Then they also said that they were going to build the 3rd temple. And they were preparing for building the 3rd temple. And indeed, they made their steps already underway for the building of the 3rd temple. And then the last point that they were going to say is they wanted it to be more Jewish, the state of Israel. So they wanted halakha law. It's rather like, if you like, Sharia, if you like, but a Jewish, Hebraic form of law. But just to be clear for all your listeners, establishing Israel on the land of Israel is the end of the Palestinian project. Finish. Okay, that's what translated that means. Secondly, rebuilding the temple, or building a third temple on the site of the Temple Mount, Haram al-Sharif, is equivalent to destroying the icon of Islamic civilization, which is Al-Aqsa Mosque. Al-Aqsa Mosque, in a sense now, has become much more important because all of those mosques in Saudi Arabia, in Mecca and Medina, and that have somehow been devalued by the Saudis. They've turned them into great shopping centers. And it's not, they've lost, and the Saudis knocked down the original mosque in which the Prophet prayed. They've knocked down his home, and they've just built these sort of five-star hotels. Whereas Al-Aqsa then has another point, which is Al-Aqsa is not Sunni, it is not Shia, it is not Muslim Brotherhood, it is not Wahhabi, it is just an icon of a civilization spanning 1,000 years, and so symbolically very important. Then just on the Friday before the 7th of October, what happened was that the settlers marched in and started entered the mosque, and have made it very clear that they intend to take it over. Just a month or two before, Netanyahu held a cabinet meeting literally under Al-Aqsa in a tunnel that exists, that the Israelis have excavated under it. So immediately under the mosque, he said, "We are landlords here. This is our territory, and we're going to take it." And so, there's a lot of talk, I've seen about, it was all about the Saudi normalization. But actually, we were reaching the culmination of a process that would end the Palestinian project and deal a crippling blow to Islam at the same time. And this is, I think, one of the key facts that people need to know. And this has been going on a long time. I remember I was lent to the American government to take part in the first fact-finding committee, the presidential fact-finding committee into the Second Intifada, just after Ariel Sharon had walked on the Temple Mount and provocatively gone to the mosque. That's what started the Second Intifada. That's what it was. But from then on, I knew that what he was doing was igniting nationalism, if you like, Jewish nationalism, and also the Temple Mount movement, which was about destroying Al-Aqsa and building the temple on it. And that process, in those days, the Temple Mount movement was tiny, nothing. But I could see what was coming from that period. Now, all that time later, because that was 20 odd years ago, now we have those groups in power in Israel, and they have this agenda, and it's a very radical agenda. And then what happened on the 7th of October was that the whole, if you like, the concept of Zionism, if you like, the conceptual idea of it was blown up, completely shattered in two elements. The first element of it was shattered because it's all about differential security rights, if you like, this was the Sharon inheritance. Instead of having separate territories, they had, if you like, levels, administrative levels, political, legal levels, roads that some people could use, others couldn't. The settlers had this, settlers had that. And the aim of giving security to all Jews on the land of Israel, the price was radical insecurity for Palestinians, that they didn't have rights, they weren't on their own land, and the Israeli army could come in at a moment of their choosing if they wanted to take military action. And what happened on the 7th of October is suddenly that, if you like, contract that seemed to exist between Jews and their government, that the Jews were free to be anywhere on the land of Israel, and say Greater Israel, and that the Israeli army and the government had their back. They were safe. And then that blew up, and suddenly Israelis inside realized they were not safe. Then the second part of it is it blew up with what happened after the 7th of October, when Israel went into Gaza and said its objective was to destroy Hamas completely and erase them from Gaza, and also the destruction and perhaps remove Palestinians altogether from Gaza and push them south into the Sinai, into Egypt. But that project has been not just going badly, it's been an abject failure. The Hamas had a very elaborate building of tunnels. These are 70 meters down. Some of them are less near the surface for getting up and down, but the main ones are about 70 meters down. They have dormitories, they have eating facilities, they have armories down there, they have mechanical facilities where they can produce weapons or dig further tunnels, and they are enormous. Gaza is not a big strip, I think 23 miles or something like that from one end to another. The tunnels are about 450 kilometers of tunnels under there.
Right.
So the battle is going at two levels, planes, if you like. So what you see when Israel goes in and says, the tanks are doing it, and now we've gone into Khan Yunis, or we've gone into Gaza City and we've turfed Hamas out, is nonsense, because the main body of Hamas is 60 to 70 meters underground. You can run cars up and down it. You can have motorcycles going from one end to the other carrying messages in no time at all. And what you see of the conflict is Hamas have these, what I call one-time throwaway tunnels. They suddenly emerge in these little tunnels that they come out of. They put an explosives on a tank, and then they disappear down another tunnel, and both tunnels are imploded immediately. That's why I call them throwaway tunnels. Right. And then they manufacture another tunnel when they need it. But this is this complex thing, so that Hamas is pretty well intact. And it's Israel who's been losing huge numbers of their forces, and large numbers of tanks and armored vehicles. No one can give an exact figure, but the majority, contrary to what you see in the press, but the majority of the Hamas forces are still intact underneath Gaza. So, when you hear, oh, Gaza, I know Gaza, by the way, quite well. I have to go there often. But when you say, oh, look, the Israelis have come in and they've taken Gaza City, the Israelis, what have they done is they've come in and they've driven along the beachfront, because beachfront is too humid. You can't have tunnels in that sort of sand.
Right.
So they've come in there. And then between Gaza City and Khan Yunis is a sort of swamp and a little river that passes down. There are no tunnels there. So when they talk about they've been in and they've, if you like, encircled an area, it means nothing, because Hamas can just drive underground to another area or come back later. So I was going
to say, I just interrupt real quick. Just to support the point, was recently the Israelis actually admitted, well, we're not going to be able to get rid of Hamas because there's 450, or roughly what, in American terms, about 260, 70 miles worth of tunnels underneath Gaza. 450 kilometers is about 270 miles for those of you who can't do math in their head. So that's the interesting part about this. And when the Israelis admitted this, that was the tell. Like for a long time, it was all, that, well, we're in control of the situation. We're doing what everybody expected us to do, blah, 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 blah. And then they had to admit that they can't. So if the Israelis hadn't admitted that, it would be a different, political
So
space, commentary space.
that's the next stage of the point. Having failed or being in the process of failing in Gaza, many Israelis have now entered, if you like, a mass formation of existential fear about the whole Zionist project. And they can see, as they say it very clearly, no one fears us anymore. We've lost our deterrence in the region, and we've lost our deterrence internally, even in the West Bank, which they control very, very much. And so then started, if you like, the next stage, which was the unity of the fronts opening up. The unity of the fronts from Hezbollah in the north started, if you like, very calibrated, started off, one civilian per civilian, one soldier per soldier, one outpost for another outpost, one military group for another. Right up till now, where they're talking about the equivalence of city to city if Israel invades. And then you have, if you like, Yemen, then importantly, Iraq. And Iraq have, if you like, in recent days, the Iraqi resistance has said they intend to fire missiles on the two remaining ports that are open, Ashdod and Haifa. The Houthis have already shut down, effectively, Eilat as a port. And so, if you like, this was the walls closing in on Israel. And the only way they can see out of this, because frankly, they've given up they counted on a quick, easy victory in Gaza against Hamas. And that a few days later, Hamas would be coming out with their hands up and they'd be stripped to their underpants and taken off. And it didn't happen. And how are they going to live? How are all the displaced Israelis sitting in these hotels in the Dead Sea? The whole of the north of Israel is evacuated. And all of them, there are something like 250,000 Israelis now displaced and in different parts of Israel, both from the area around Gaza, but from the north. They were evacuated, living at government expense in hotels. And the government has promised, you're going back. You will go back to your homes in the north. The settlers there say, no, forget it. Do you really think we're going to look out of our kitchen window and see a fence with Hezbollah flags on it and Hezbollah walking along the other side of it? I mean,
Right.
We're not going back. We won't feel safe. And so then the government promised, okay, well, we'll remove Hezbollah to the far side of this river called the Litani River, which cuts across Lebanon, which is about 30 miles, roughly, just less than 30 miles north of the Blue Line, which is the actual sort of separation point between the two states. And the defense minister gave it as a guarantee that it would be done in January. Well, it hasn't happened, but the American government has started negotiations to try and persuade Hezbollah voluntarily to move back across this line. And of course, we all know Hezbollah is never going to be disarmed and move back. I won't go into the details, but it goes back to the outcome of the 2006 war. There was the Security Council Resolution 1701 that was never implemented, but contained Israel's wish list of Hezbollah to be disarmed and moved across. Hezbollah today is probably the third most powerful military force in the region. They have modern weapons. They have very skilled and experienced forces. But Israelis, on really a majority of them, say the only way we can reestablish deterrence, the only way we can save the Zionist project is by a big victory. And that victory has to be a victory over Hezbollah. That's what we need. And it is a huge, huge gamble. It's a gamble that is very likely to enmesh the United States in the most ghastly mess if they decide to accept that. And effectively, the US has given the green light to that. Austin was there and others have been there, and they've said, okay, we understand you need to get the people back into the States, and let's try diplomatic means, and if the diplomatic means don't work, then you will have to use military means to push Hezbollah back. And that's where things stand at the moment. The last point, and then I'll stop talking for you, is there's been a huge shift in public sentiment in Israel, more than the one I indicated at the beginning. Overall, Israel has moved strongly to the right. Now, 90% of Israelis approve. I mean, there was a poll that came out just the other day. 96% of Israelis believe that the force was fully justified that has been used in Gaza. I mean, the destruction of the whole strip, virtually. I mean, this is quite shocking to people, I think, in the West somehow, that 96%. Yes, there are 4%, and those you see, 4% is generally on the Western television saying, oh, yes, we can find some solution or something like 96% would never agree to a solution by which all the hostages come back, that there would then be a ceasefire or a temporary stopping of the attacks on Gaza. And as part of the solution, there would be security guarantees given to the Hamas leaders. 96% won't have it. 45% of Israelis say not enough violence was used. 45%. Not enough violence is being used in Gaza. And another, I think it was 30-something% said, we don't accept any agreement, any deal about Gaza whatsoever. In other words, it needs to be clear. Yep. So this is it. And then all the other things, like two-state solutions, are really just PR being used by Washington and the White House to suggest that, Biden is managing this and he's successfully sort of doing politics to bring this to an end and to lower the flames. And if only we can get Gaza quiet, then everything else in the region would die down. But the real prospect is that, the walls are closing in and Israel really has no way out except by escalation. Stop that.
Okay, well, so let's talk about what's happened recently with the Biden administration bombing something like 85 different targets 48 hours ago and last night, and there are also reports of the Israelis striking in Syria. So that to me is the far more important part of this, right? Because you knew that the Biden administration telegraphed for days, oh, by the way, get out. This is where we're going to attack so that we can put on a light show. But it's the Israelis continuing to attack Syria in order to ensure that there's no, what I would imagine, any resupply of Hezbollah, that this is actually shaping the ground for what they're going to do next in the south of Lebanon. Am I correct in that assessment?
No, not really. Not really. That what it's doing is trying to provoke Hezbollah into an overreaction sufficiently that they can draw the United States into supporting Israel, not only in Lebanon against Hezbollah, but, and this is wishful thinking on the government's part in Israel, but bring the United States into a war on Iran. That's why we always hear Iran linked this, Iran this.
Of course.
It's all about that, the Lindsey Graham fantasies.
So, yeah, what I was going to say is, and knowing that intimately Putin and Russia are involved in Syria, and Putin has been standing there for years telling him, don't take the bait. Don't take the bait. He hasn't taken the bait on Nord Stream 2 or the Kerch Strait bridge bombings or blowing up hundreds of Russian civilians in an airliner and yada, yada, yada. These are all provocations to try and draw Russia into an overreaction that has failed. And so far, the Iranians and Hezbollah have done the same thing, saying, well, we're not going to get drawn into this because we know where this goes.
No, it's not really like that, Tom. Sorry to say that.
No, that's fine. If I'm wrong, I'm wrong. I'm happy
Russia,
I'm happy to be
there
disabused.
is a thing called this is what we have, the axis of resistance, as it calls itself, or the United Fronts.
Right. And
Russia is not a principal in this one. Not a main player in this one.
Right.
It is other states, and Hezbollah and Iran and others, the Hashad al-Shaabi, or the principal parts, and also the Houthis. Now, this is therefore there's been this plan, of which 7th of October was the manifestation of it. It has been prepared for several years. Now, this plan, the building of tunnels and all the preparations for it. And it is not ordinary politics. Very important people understand that. It's not, why? Don't the Palestinians understand that there's nothing to gain by this, that, ultimately they will be crushed and Israel is so strong and everything? It's nothing about that. This is revolutionary politics. And yes, revolutionary politics means the spilling of blood. And that was accepted and understood that, because Sinwar knows and understands the Israeli psychology extremely well, having been in prison for 20 years in Israel. He's good at this and knew exactly what would be the reaction on the 7th of October, expected, and it came just as they thought. And then the process is there's an operations room. It moves around. Sometimes it's here or Beirut or somewhere else, and all those the Revolutionary Guards of Iran and Hezbollah and everyone participates in this, and it works on the process of consensus, strategic consensus, not tactical consensus. Each party has the right to do the operation as they think fit, in the way they think fit. But the overall framework of this process is agreed. And that's why you saw Hassan Nasrallah, the first time he gave his talk, actually putting on his glasses and reading the text, because it was an agreed text that he had negotiated with other people. Now, others may join in and Russia, of course, knows exactly what's going on and probably is consulted by Iran, if nothing else. So you have this, and the aim has got, besides consensus, the other two pillars, which are important, is to protect the nation state, to not allow the conflict to get to the point where America comes in and just reduces everyone's state to the level of Gaza. So the aim is, and particularly vulnerable states, Syria is sort of very vulnerable to American bombing, because America just bombs Syria whenever it feels like. So it's about protecting if you like, the state. And to do that, the aim is to have a very carefully calibrated escalatory ladder. We go up step by step by step.
Right.
And further, it could be the Houthis today, it could be Iraq tomorrow, could be Hezbollah the next day. Little steps up, and to keep the West off balance and Israel off balance. So, everyone's looking for Iraq to do something today. Maybe the Houthis do something like
It'll
this.
be Hezbollah.
Carefully calibrated so that it doesn't provoke Armageddon in the region. And there's a lot of consultation. Iran is all the time talking to Saudi Arabia, keeping them informed. They're not part of the resistance, but they are kept informed by Iran. So it's a careful process which is intended to squeeze Israel hard to the point at which it has little choice, either to give up Zionism, abandon Zionism, and rethink their whole project in the region, or to face some form of humiliating defeat and then have a solution forced onto them. The demography is now equal, about 7.3 on either side.
Okay, yeah, that makes sense. The point I was trying to make, it wasn't that I thought that Putin was directing any of this, but that the lessons that it's analogous to what people have seen in the West by how Putin is in control of the escalatory framework in Ukraine. I think the way you've just laid it out is that yes, the axis of resistance, or the Iranian, led nominally by Iran, at least in Western minds, they're in charge of the escalatory framework here, and this is one of the things that's been bothering me in my analysis of what's been going on in the Red Sea and everything else, is that clearly the U.S. is not in charge of the escalatory framework. They are the ones being forced to effectively react to everybody else's moves in order to support, quote unquote, their ally in the region, Israel, or at least however you want to frame the U.S. Israeli relationship at this point, which I think is far more complicated than people want to. And far more complicated than a lot of people want to make it out to be, which is, oh no, they just, the Jews just run everything. I'm like, no, not really. It's a little bit more complicated than that. I hate to burst anybody's bubble, but if you haven't already gotten the point this morning, or as you're listening to this, that these issues are far more complicated and far more nuanced than people think they are, that's where we are. So, just to understand. So if I understand this correctly, and I've seen this from the beginning, the entire region, this is not just a squeeze on Israel as a political thing and as a religious thing, but it's also as an economic attack focused on the greater Pax Americana and inheritance of the old colonial European maritime empire, because we're talking about the major part of the world's trade routes go through here. We're talking about the Suez Canal and the Red Sea, and
of course,
it's all of this stuff. So it starts here about in fact, crazy Zionists wanting to build the third temple, and it explodes to the potential existential threat for the entire
precisely
500+ year colonial project of Europe.
Exactly, the whole Western project, in fact. Right. I mean, it is, just as we've seen with I know it wasn't shown much in America or in Europe about the Court of Justice, but, it wasn't just Israel on trial. It was the whole Western colonial project that was on trial, and all of the things that we had done during that period. I mean, so you had countries like Namibia and saying, you're talking about sort of ethnic cleansing and even, going further and calling it a complete killing of a people. And they said, well, what about happened to us? What the Germans did to us? Why aren't we having a trial about that as well? And of course, all these echoes. So it's becoming a sort of a much wider sort of conflict. The overtones from the central explosion, the ripples are sort of widening, and it's becoming a sort of a center of the next era. I think it's going to set that and Ukraine are going to be the poles setting the new era, because I can't underline how angry people are in the Islamic world about what they're seeing in Gaza, how disgusted they feel about it. And it's really, it's something, it's not just, the Arab street getting irritated. This is far more serious. And we're seeing a new form of thing coming out, I think. It's not about Islamism, because I see people talking about Islamism all the time. I tried to say, I remember meeting the founder of Hamas before he was assassinated. And it was really striking because, he was paraplegic, sitting in a wheelchair and very crumpled little figure. But my goodness, he radiated sort of strength and, very powerful figure. And he said to me, listen, this is not a project of Hamas. This is not an Islamic project. This is a national liberation. It's about liberation that we are involved. And anyone can join it. A Christian, Druze, you can join it if you want to join the Hamas project. And, it wasn't, a Muslim Brotherhood. It wasn't Wahhabi. It was liberation. And this is sort of resonated in the region in quite a strong way, because we already had the sort of anti-colonial feeling that was present, and which Russia has been orchestrating to a certain extent. And then you have Islam, but it's not a particular ideological Islam. It is Islam as a civilizational project that brought us astronomy, medicine, philosophy, all these things, which has for the last 100 years been put on and put down, and it's been suppressed. And there is a sort of sense of liberating, being able, a civilization liberation for this project. Very powerful force, because we haven't had nationalism linked with Islam since about 53 or 58.
Oh, that, and again, I think this is a very interesting way of putting it, because you and I have talked in the past about, how these are civilizational conflicts, right? About that we get lost between system and civilization. I was just thinking off the top of my head now, back to some of the previous conversation you and I have had about and then that's what's at stake here. And I think everybody, whether anybody wants to admit it or not, right? This is always the fun part about parsing the diplo speak, or the diplomatic speak, or lack of diplomatic speak, is that this is really about the big stuff. This is about whether or not we're going to, whether that the entire old way of doing things is going to survive. And this is why I, on a regular basis, focus more now on the monetary system, and how those things are, and how the maneuvers hit there are actually happening at the same time as the geopolitical stuff is happening, right? So, so now let's turn our focus to, because you brought up Ukraine. I want to turn our eye on that, because I've been watching carefully this winter for about the last year, previous to about 3 months ago, for about a year. I just checked out on what was going on the ground in Ukraine, because I was like, well, this clearly we're in a kind of lull. And then we waited for the quote unquote counteroffensive, which was really just an offensive, this summer, which failed. And now we're watching the Russians during the winter, and how they're strategically using this time to grind out various positions that the Ukrainians have in the center of the conflict line in the Donbass. And it's been very effective, and it's been relatively low cost. So now I'm looking at the way this lays out for 2024 from an election standpoint in Europe, the United States. I'm also thinking about the Russian elections coming up next month and Putin's inauguration in May. And I have to wonder, does Putin see this summer as the summer that he has to kind of wrap up Ukraine at a strategic level? Because whether we believe or don't believe what's going on in the West, the amount of rearming that's happening across NATO for 20. And this
Yeah.
is clearly, in my mind, they're setting up for 2025, 2026 as a major push by NATO to come into Ukraine and push the Russians back. I don't know that they're delusional. I'm not saying that this is a good plan, or like this is what I see. So I'm watching this process that where 2024 winds up being the time frame in which everybody feels like they have to go for broke. The Russians have to make a big move and territory gain in Ukraine. The quote unquote Davos or colonial powers in Europe have to clamp down and get the United States on a path to the solution so that they can win their part of this thing and get us into a war that we can't afford to fight. You can see how, but I think you can see what I'm trying to get at here, the things I've been talking about for a long time. What do you think about, what do you see in pick any one of those topics to talk about from a perspective of there's a time limit on the current situation? Pick one of those and talk about it. I'd be fine.
Okay, I see quite a bit differently. I see it in a sense that the war effectively is settled, but it isn't not over. And this is only a first part, because the real war is something quite different, which is, if you like, finding a modus vivendi between what Mackinder called the Rimland, the North Atlantic people, and the heartland, Russia, China, and its economic interests of the Belt and Road and the corridors and so on. And we're nowhere near that. And so that is really the long-term sort of process. It's not anyone to talk with. When I was in Russia recently, they made it very clear. I mean, they just think the Europeans are scum. I mean, really, they have no time for talking. So they're not interested in that. They don't think there's any interlocutor in the United States at this time. And because I was talking to them and saying, the situation in America is very, very unsettled. And, we have two candidates that are going forward in this. But, at the end of this, even if there are elections, at the end of it, you may have someone who's won office, but is not in a position to commit, because the whole process has got so fragmented and there are sort of warlords around. I mean, I use the term warlords loosely, but I mean, power brokers around the structures that, there will be fragmentation and disorientation and dysfunctionality. And that therefore, even after, January, whatever it is, then 25, you may have no one ready who you can talk to them, but they can't commit. And I think they're thinking long term. But on Ukraine, no. I mean, the war's over. I mean, Russia have won it. And what they're really waiting to see at this moment, I mean, the infighting in Kiev is, I mean, it's just the core element of it is sort of in conflict and deconstructing. I'm talking about the ultra-nationalist core to this process, with the military not part of that and the civilians left out of it altogether, the civil population. But the core is disintegrating, partly because there's not going to be enough money. You have a better view than me, but I'm pretty skeptical that any money is really going to come through Congress for Ukraine. Maybe a little bit, but not much. Big play about the European. 50 billion from Europe. Well, actually, it's over 4 years. So that relates to about 12.5 billion per year. Just to keep central Ukrainian services and functions going requires about 25 to 35 billion during this period. So it's going to be well short of that even, and that's discounting the military, completely discounting the military. So how long can you go on like this? I remember in Afghanistan, I was there during the time when the Soviet Union imploded. And I remember at the time I was I couldn't understand what was going on at the moment. The Russians had had a very good year previously, and ambushes, and the Mujahideen were all sitting outside of the country, moaning and drinking green tea and saying, can we have more special weapons and things? And suddenly everything stopped dead. And I thought, what on earth is it? And I said this, I went to Washington and said, something's happened. Of course, I didn't know what had happened was the Soviet Union was in the process of disassembling itself completely. But the point was, when the center breaks, the periphery stops dead, because who wants to be the last person dying in that sort of circumstances in a war that's going to be overtaken and forgotten very, very quickly? And so I think the Russians are seeing it like that, and they're seeing it. So they, first of all, they're waiting to see if the sort of present crisis inside Kiev actually completely implodes the political systems there. I mean, that core, which is quite small, because the money is less and less, and you can see it shrinking away from, if you like, the outer parts. I mean, people are not getting paid, things are not happening. And, there is another aspect to this. I mean, people just feel, I saw a very telling thing, not a political one, and a Ukrainian wrote and said, I mean, what's our future? Look, 1 million of our men have just disappeared. I don't mean killed, I'm talking about they're not there because either they've been, suffered traumatic injuries or they've left the country. They said, how do we run it? Yesterday, the dentist was taken. They came out at dawn and grabbed any man they could get and threw him in the thing and went off. Who's going to go back to those towns and villages anyway? If there are no men, how are you going to resettle these places? And they said, it's finished. And I try and get across what I saw in other conflicts, that sometimes, the psychology just crumbles and people say, oh my God, this is it. I mean, we have to do something.
That is, I think, very much a human thing, that we live in a reality of our own intellectual or devising, and then we have this image of ourselves, and then once we get the right piece of information that says, oh, that's not the way it works, then Rene Girard called that the mimetic collapse, and then all of a sudden a new reality takes over, right? And so what you're describing for Ukraine is that we're in that moment where we're getting close to the tipping point where we're gonna have a critical mass of people go, oh my God, and then it's all just gonna stop.
What's that? That animal that runs off the cliff.
Right.
The cartoon character that
a Wile E. Coyote.
Coyote, Wile E. Coyote runs off the cliff, and for a moment he's then thinking this fine, and he's still running along like this, and then, oh my God!
And then he looks down, and boom, and then he falls.
So the Russians see the situation a bit like that.
Okay.
And therefore, they don't want to. I mean, if there's no one to talk to and no one then takes charge, then they will move, but they don't want to kill people unnecessarily. They'll just move in. I mean, it'll be like Afghanistan. There will be no resistance.
And
it's also because the Russians see this. I don't know how I can express this to you, but Russia sees this in terms also that Russia is finding itself in a new way. It's going through a process of transformation and coming together, and they're quite pleased with the way in which the idea of the Russian nation, the Russian people, Ruski Mir, is forming. And they see Ukraine, or at least the eastern and central parts of Ukraine, not the western parts, which they feel were really Austro-Hungarian from the beginning, but they see those other parts as really something that will happen. Let me just explain it in one simple anecdote. I went to see, I was in one of the monasteries in Moscow, and they said to me, it was quite dramatic. The Communist Party collapsed, and then all these churches that had been shut for years and years, suddenly someone turned the key in a lock, opened the doors. And the thing it was not organized or managed or anything, just people came back in. And, it's even worse in Ukraine. And so somehow the Russians think that somehow, when the doors are opened, when the ultranationalists are gone, they can go back into their churches, which have all been sort of looted and closed down. Who knows? I mean, it might be, and they see this really as part of destiny. I know that sounds strange to Westerners listening to, but they see this reassimilation of Ukraine is something that, they don't have to rush to it. It'll come to them. Just
Right.
let it happen. So I don't know there's going to be huge military offensive. As to
Okay.
your last point, and I just finish with that, as to your last point, I mean, I'm speaking from Europe and in Europe. Europe has absolutely no means for fighting Russia. And all of this nonsense about, teaching Swedes to prepare for war with Russia. Russia is not mobilized for war with Europe anyway. It would have
Right.
to remobilize, it would do everything, have to change so many things. And it's not interested. For God's sake, they don't even want to talk to Macron or Schultz
Right.
or anything, let alone have the whole of the Europeans with their wokeness, with their peculiar, fascination with sexuality and things in their society. No, thank you, not at all. And so all we're doing this is really this talk about war with Russia, I believe, is simply a means to sort of put pressure to say, we've got to keep Ukraine going, just at least up to the election. More money, please, Europe. More money, please, from the GOP. Let's have something so we can we don't have a Kabul. We can't afford to have
Oh my.
images like Kabul happening to us from Ukraine. So let's just give them something to keep it ticking over. The trouble is, the military don't have men. They don't have shells, weapons. It's just not going to work, I think.
Well, the interesting, but you see, here's the problem though. Looking at it from what I'm seeing here in the United States, and this is the problem. I see all of this as well, Alistair. I'm not disagreeing with you, but I also see is I see a political class in specifically London and Washington that refuse to give up on the idea that they're going to be able to do. This is a part of the political class that's happening, and they're the ones that are backing Nikki Haley, for example,
Mm.
in order to keep Nikki Haley in the race, so that we could wind up with they still harbor hope that they can put Trump in jail or
Mm.
disqualify him from running, so that they can run Nikki Haley against Joe
Mhm.
Biden or Michelle Obama or Gavin Newsom or whomever they're gonna draft, right? And then they can use that to ensure that they do not get a win. Now, no matter who wins, we lose. Because look, I'm in the middle of writing an article right now about how no one less than Yuval Harari of the World Economic Forum is now openly grousing about the populists winning and that they're losing, right?
Mm.
So now the question is, will we? There's this thing about we can't let this. Can we really lose to these people? Can we really lose to these dirty Slavs and these horrible Iranians and all there's still this solipsism that that exists within that class, and then there's the military, and then of course we have all of the economic incentives within the American political system to up military budgets and to get new contracts and blah 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 blah. And we're looking at a situation economically where we see economic headlines that say, well, we're producing new jobs and unemployment is low, and even though we're at 5.5% and blah blah and all this stuff. And the reality is that it's all part-time jobs in the private sector and it's all full-time jobs in the government sector.
Yeah,
Right.
exactly.
So, right. So it's all a fake Potemkin village as well in so many different ways. And I'm what scares me, and because I'm here in it and to see it. What scares me is that you are correct, but they refuse to see it. And then the
Yes.
question is, do the Russians see what we're seeing and say, okay, how do we respond to this? Because the reality is that, like, I saw something this morning on, of a leaked, I don't know how this could be LARPing. I saw it on a Telegram channel. It doesn't matter, of a leaked British plan for
Yeah, I saw
about what's
that.
going on with Ukraine, right? And I looked at that and I went, so they're living in a fantasy world. So the Russians we're gonna put NATO troops in Finland and Sweden, for example. This is one of the points, in order to draw the Russians away from the contact line. And I'm like, really? No, if the Finns and the Swedes decide to come over the border, Finland and Sweden are going to get nuked. There's not going to be any other discussion. They're not going to move troops out of the combat zone in order to stop the Finns and the Swedes from coming across the border. Like, the Russians have made this clear, and they'll have every reason and to do so. It's insanity. If you can speak to some of that, because I'm sure you understand the imperatives within the British mindset, political mindset, better than
Yes.
I do. And I try.
I heard your
really do, but I would
comments
hope that
about
you
the
understand
Brits.
this better than I do.
Everyone's
So,
fed up with them. Well, to tell you the truth, so am I. So, I mean, it's not really surprise. Um, uh, uh, Look, the Russians take a longer view, and I know this is a bit difficult, but when I was speaking to them, I gave them a sort of anecdote about where we were, I thought, in the West, and I referred to an early general, a general that was actually a Tsarist in the Tsarist army and had fought and was a highly decorated man. And he came back towards the end of the First World War to St. Petersburg. He came into St. Petersburg and was shocked because, there was no order. The army were sort of stealing, robbing, in complete disarray. And then he went to a theater, and he was in the theater, and he said, it was just, life went on as normal. All the St. Petersburg people were sort of, enjoying the theater. And he said, they don't seem to understand the mayhem that is existing outside it. So he said he got in a train and went straight to see the Tsar. And he knew him, of course, personally. And he went to see the Tsar. And he went into the court, and only to be shocked because he found all the Romanov women and girls were wearing red ribbons. And he said, I knew then it was over, because 80% of the Romanov were actually sympathizing. They thought that the people who were going to end up murdering them were friendly and sympathetic to them. And I said, in many ways, we in Europe are in the same sort of betweenness that he talked about. We have a revolution going on, but only half the population actually think they're in a revolution. Half the people know they're in a revolution, but the other half, they say, well, it's normal. We're just getting a little bit more diverse, and isn't it a good thing? It's something. In other words, 80% of the European women, if they were wearing it, were not wearing a red ribbon, but a rainbow ribbon.
right.
And that, this is going to take time to work out in Europe and America. And that's why you may not find you have an interlocutor in the next few years.
Yeah.
I don't know where it's going to go, but the counter-revolution has started in Europe. European counter-revolution will depend, I think, hugely on what happens in America. America will largely set what happens in Europe.
Mm-hmm.
But, when the Russians look at it, they think, these Brussels leaders and everything who take the stupid to a new meaning of being just stupid. I mean, I don't know. We've got a whole class that just is completely stupid, and we have all this class there, and the Russians think, a few years, we wait for a new generation, it'll come in, and then we do politics again in a different way. So I don't think they're getting all. They know, look, if NATO really made a move on Russia, Russia would just take down the satellites, and then NATO wouldn't be able to operate. They are totally dependent on ISR,
Hmm.
reconnaissance and intelligence and their satellites and their
Right.
communications like that. They would not be able to do a thing in Russia or Ukraine, for that matter, if Russia decided. They have lots of new equipment coming online, which is, EW equipment and things like that, electronic warfare, which is sort of puts a whole code. They're not showing everything at this
Yeah,
stage.
I
So
don't,
I think
and I don't
so
believe
I
that
think
we've
they'll
shown every.
just,
Yeah, so I'm
so I
sorry. Go
don't
ahead.
know if that expresses it, but I'm
Yeah.
saying we're in this sort of
Yes.
betweenness phase in
Well,
Europe. Sort of counter-revolution is starting, but hasn't really got on its feet. Half the population is sort of wishy-washy, wearing, rainbow flags that they support, a woke world, and others are suffering from this. Even, our farmers. How is it John Kerry gets up and say we must do less farming? They're stupid.
I know.
It's
Man,
stupidity, I think, as
it
much as
truly
anything.
is at a level that is breathtaking. And yeah, no, I agree with you because it was, I think, I mean, if I wasn't the first to start talking about the counter revolution within the United States at the banking level, right?
Mm,
I saw it there. I saw it at the Fed and the banking level and
exactly.
everything
I
else.
remember you did.
Right.
And
It's and so, I can see exactly what you're talking about. And every day I'm like, I keep using the phrase comfortable wolves. We were comfortable up to a certain point. And when I'm writing about the way I'm thinking about it now in terms of the timeline, and then during COVID, we started becoming like anxious because we weren't sure about the leadership of the pack, at the pack leadership. And now we're into full blown, okay, so which pack do we need to be a part of? And we're not comfortable anymore. We're anxious and nervous, and you know what happens with anxious and nervous dogs? They tend to bite. They tend to do things that they act out because they don't understand the rules anymore.
yeah,
And these people, in order to hold on to power, have thought that, well, if we change the rules and make you uncomfortable, that'll make you fearful, and then you'll suppress. Then it makes you easier to suppress. And got news for you, that's not the way this works. Like, if you think that that's the way that works, we go right back to the beginning of this conversation. Then I give
exactly.
you the Middle East. I give you Gaza. What you wind up with is 450 miles worth of freaking tunnels, and you wind up with the entire time we've been speaking this morning. All I can think of is, well, I gotta make sure that I get my tickets to go see the second half of Dune, because this is just reminding me, like, oh look, the Fremen are showing up all over the place, and the question now is, who's going to be the Fremen, and how much violence do you really want to impart? Now I'm watching the Israelis, and I'm thinking, oh my God, they're the Harkonnens. They're
Yeah,
like
no, this is
acting
right.
almost, and it's insane. And
Uh, and I don't want to, when I was trying to give the impression of the sort of Russian, sort of long view type of
mhm.
why they're not sort of fussed by what's being said in Europe about in Sweden and things. However, everyone recognizes how dangerous it is. I mean, what I've been expressing is that Israel, the vast majority of Israelis, it's not Netanyahu. Everything is sort of focused, oh, Netanyahu's the problem. Once he's gone, everything. Look at the polls. The
Mhm.
polls show something quite different. Majority of Israelis thinks that the Zionist project can only survive by catharsis. It has to go through a process of catharsis in order to find itself again. And
Mhm.
in many respects, we have to do that too.
Mhm.
And it's going to be so. It's certainly a dangerous place, particularly as we only have stupid people in leadership positions. And this is, I mean, it
And
really, they won't even open themselves to thinking differently. They just
they
prefer
they
just to stay here.
it's funny, they literally, just this week, think about what Viktor Orban tried to do to stop the funding, and think about how far they moved heaven and earth to force Orban to knuckle under. Everybody can see what happened. Everybody can see that it's not that the European Union is really at its core not, a 27 equals, under one flag. It's not. It is absolutely certain groups run the thing, and this is what's going to happen. And your job is to pay lip service to this and to be an actor telling everybody that, that we're all one big happy family, when the reality is that it's not. Right. And so every time they do something like that, this is we get closer and closer to the critical mass or the tipping point of when everybody goes, all right, these people are not acceptable as leaders. And every day that this happens is another day where we get closer to that moment where we have the big meta collapse. Hopefully it happens before there's a spasm of violence that puts hundreds of millions of people in graves. That's I don't know that we're going to avoid that. Right? I'm not sanguine about that outcome, but we
Nobody
at least should understand all of the ramifications of and all of the impetuses and the psychology of the people that are pulling this, that are making the decisions about what's going to happen.
There's always, the risk of a Samson pulling down the temple on everybody. And, who knows where it would start. Whatever my experience in all of these things, wherever they've been intifadas or conflicts, is it starts in a place that you don't expect it. And there's often quite a trivial incident in the first place that starts it. And then it just takes off from that process. And so I think, it is, of course, it's a very dangerous period. And, with the Zion project as a whole, and as Israelis see it, as really in existential threat, you can never tell what will be, how this will play out. But also that feeling of fear is feeding into your politics, because it operates through the political structures in the United States that are very powerful, and in Europe in the same way. But yes, this is the process I think we're going into, and we'll have to see, where it's going to lead. But I think actually one of the dangers is that this determination to ignore and just not discuss and not to say, what is happening to Israel in any sensible way, but just to try and doubt, we're going to try and do this, and then we'll have a Palestinian state and we'll recognize it and all of this. They don't understand that Israel already had a Palestinian state. It was actually the apartheid state was the Palestinian state at that time. So, they don't want it. And unless people start thinking a little bit more seriously, I think, it will become much more dangerous.
Well, I think we'll just have to leave it there for now, because we could probably do this for, I don't know, the rest of the day. And let's take that in and work with that, and then we'll do this again. I don't know, probably a lot sooner than we've done between the last time you and I spoke, because I think it's important. I do appreciate all of that, because it really is a moment in time that we are reaching one of those inflection points. And I think between now and I want to say the Russian inauguration, I think is going to be a very, very dangerous and difficult time. A lot of things are coming together around the March through May time period, at the both at a monetary policy level here in the United States, the politics and everything else, and then all of it, and the spring thaw and Ukraine. So we'll see. Alastair Crooke, thank you very much for your time and attention this morning. I really do appreciate it, as always, sir. Thank you.
Thank you for inviting me.
Well, that'll about wrap it up for episode 169 of the Gold, Goats, and Guns podcast. I want to thank Alastair Crooke for really bringing to light some aspects of this conflict that we're not talking about, I think, nearly in depth enough. And for that reason, it's why I had him on the podcast this morning, and I really appreciate him taking the time to elucidate some of these ideas. All right. So with that said, I'm out for this time. And as always, you can follow my work at my blog at tomluongo.me. You can follow me on Patreon at patreon.com/goldgoatsandguns, where you can sign up for either the biweekly market reports and or the Gold Goats and Guns investment newsletter, where we take all of this stuff that's happening and try and wrap it up into a neat portfolio strategy to help immunize you against a world going completely mad. And of course, you can follow me on Twitter at TFL1728, where I really do try to be as entertaining and as obnoxious as possible. So you guys be well. You take care. We'll talk soon. Keep your stick on the ice.